afternoon, everybody. Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Lucknow, is beginning a series of lectures on translation theory and translation today. In our first lecture series, I'm delighted to introduce you to Professor Krishna Manavalli, professor in the Department of English at the University of Mysore. Professor Manavalli has received the 2019 Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award for a translation of Kamber's novel Karimai. And she has had a lovely stint at United States as a professor in the English department at Illinois State University. Professor Krishna Manavalli is also a member of the English Advisory Board of Sahitya Academy. She's a trained musician. She is indebted to her guru, Pandit Rajiv Taranathji, who is a Sarod maestro, for her translation is as creative an endeavor as music. And in one of her interviews, she says, you must soak yourself in a rag for a long time before you can start singing it creatively. She has soaked herself in Kamber's writing to get his idiom and his vision. And I must share this with you that I was introduced to Chandrasekhar Kambar by Krishna Manavalli when I met her in 2020, early 2020 at Coimbatore, where she gifted me a copy of Shiva's Drum. This was a translation by Krishna of Chandrasekhar Kambar's novel Shiva's Drum. Winner of the Gyanpith Award in 2010, Krishna Chandrasekhar Kambar is a very well-known writer, and he has written in Kannada, and I'm really happy to have met Kambar through Krishna. She is not just a translator, but she has worked in multiple areas. She has presented the rich diversity of Indian culture and literature through her work. I would now invite Professor Krishna Manavalli to deliver her talk, and the title of her talk is The Play is the Thing, looking at Chandrasekhar Kambar's plays. We are all delighted and we're really, really happy to introduce you to Krishna Manavalli. Krishna.
Good afternoon to you all, and it just feels wonderful to be with you here. And thanks so much, Ranu, for that lovely introduction, which makes me feel so good about myself. And it's just lovely to be here with you, even if on the virtual platform. I would have loved to be there, as I told you, in Lucknow, and then spend this quality time with you. But then, given the circumstances, I think this is the best we can do for now. And I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for me to come there and to meet you all, and then to be with you and probably talk to you offline. But for now, this is wonderful. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and thanks so much again. Now, before I start my talk, I just want to clarify a couple of things, because we are talking both about Indian writing and then also translations. I thought I would like to give a talk which straddles both these areas. So I'll start talking about Kambar's writing, specifically his plays, and then move on to talk about my translations of Kambar and the manner in which I approach Kambar's works, and then the kind of philosophy of translation that I have, and then the way I try to work with these very rich Kannada texts of Kambar. So I want to begin with these marvelous words of my guru, who talks about Kambar and the whole trajectory of his writing. Quote, dipping into pardonable autobiography, I must confess that my early acquaintance with the kind of writings I found in Chandrasekhar Kambar, this was way back in 1964, was very new to my Navya taste buds of those days. This was around the time he wrote Helatini Kela, But by the time Jokumaru Swami arrived, I had begun to sense the fascinating spread of his literary intentions. The play seemed to insist on a message of passion, closely related to sexuality, the body, and the body politic as well. I became an avid follower of Kambar's growth as a writer. His use of sexuality as a central and powerful theme and his struggle out of its grasp. The latter part of his career witnesses an attempt to cover areas of creativity which could not be accommodated inside the constrictions of this strong force of sexuality. I'd assert that it is this constant and consistent presence which turns all of Kambar's writing into his legitimate oeuvre. End quote. This is the illustrious Sarod Maestro, the influential literary critic of the 60s and 70s, as I said, and my guru and model translator too, Pandit Rajiv Taranacci, describing the journey of Kambar, beginning from his earliest poem, Helati Nikela, to the most recent play, Mahmud Gawan, which I have translated now. And in fact, these words are from his introduction to Kambarji's Mahmud Gawan. The stalwart Kannada writer, Gnanpith Award winner, and perhaps the brilliant myth maker of this country, Chandrasekhar Kambar today is truly a global writer. His works, rooted in the North Karnataka folk culture and its very rich lore, have traveled across national and international contexts. As a translator, critic, and also a reader familiar with his writing for a very, very long time, I'm just fascinated with the manner in which this 84-year-old writer writes even today. I think it's a kind of a demonic energy with which he writes. And not only that, it's the amazing range, the manner in which he covers a whole lot of genres that makes me really, really amazed by his work. An academic, administrator, filmmaker, theater person, what have you, Kambar is someone who has also received the highest awards in this country. Incidentally, this year he's been awarded the prestigious Padma Bhushan. And I think it's a wonderful happenstance that I'm talking about him now, this time about his writing, and I'm also kind of thinking about my own translations of Kambar and the centrality of Kambar to the literature in this country and also literature in the global context. Currently, he's the president of the Sahitya Academy, New Delhi, and he is somebody who has worked with literary genres like poetry, prose, plays, even film scripts. He's made films too. And it's impossible to look at the whole corpus of this writing in this short span of this talk. So probably what I'll do is I'll just focus on his plays, because after all, Kambar is somebody who is hailed as bringing in a new direction to Indian theatre, or perhaps international theatre too, because his plays have been performed abroad, and then they have won very high acclaim. So he is somebody who introduced the folk theatre forms into Kannada writing, and perhaps brought the folk theatre forms to the foreground even in the larger national context. In fact, Kambar is somebody who questions the kind of imported literary traditions which found their home in this Navya or the modernist writing in Kannada, especially towards the mid to late 20th century. Instead, he's somebody who upholds the language and the mythologies that emanate from the collective psyche of a folk culture. In this folk imaginary, history blends with myth, and time is fused with space. Besides, Kambar has frequently maintained that the North Karnataka folk culture in which he grew up and from which he draws his inspiration is something that is connected with the ancient Dravidian ethos. And the Dravidian culture, which was patently matriarchal, is something that he goes back to again and again in his works. And so his works can be connected with the very rich Tamil and Kannada literatures of the southern part of India. Interestingly enough, Kambar's earliest research project in Chicago I thought that was a message for me. That's right. Interestingly enough, Kambar's earliest research project in Chicago, where he went on a Fulbright scholarship, and later his own research, doctoral research, were all about tracing the folk theater traditions in India and especially in Karnataka. In Kambar's view, the theater is essentially people's theater because folk theater is something which is crucially connected with people, the folk. Unlike in places like Mysore, for instance, North Karnataka did not enjoy a lot of royal patronage. So it becomes more and more important for the people, the rural people and the folk, the people to uphold these dramatic traditions. And it's their taste, their ethos which shaped this folk theater. And with the advent of modernity, there was definitely a decline in the popular support for this theater. Even in the southern part of India, we see a similar syndrome, except perhaps for popular theater forms like Yakshagana in Karnataka or the Kathakali in Kerala. A lot of theater forms are on the decline. And in these circumstances, I think it's only a few writers like Kambar who have succeeded in bringing the theater alive on the national and international contemporary stage. Even in the mid 20th century, while his Navya peer writers were busy adopting European absurd mode or like upholding the Brechtian ideals, Kambar went back to quote unquote Desi theater traditions. No doubt he occasionally chooses to write a realistic play, or like he might even work with the absurd to an extent. But by and large, his writing is something which is very firmly rooted in the folk theater traditions. At the same time, his plays and his world vision is something which keeps in step with the contemporary cultural, political, and social currents of our times. Besides, this folk vision is also crucially connected with the location of marginality, particularly in terms of caste and class marginality. This becomes important when you think of how a lot of writing in Kannada, for instance, or the writing which emerged from the marginal locations, were moving towards a sort of a folk tradition. And why did that happen? There is this interesting Kannada critic and poet D.R. Nagaraj who makes an interesting observation. Quote, the response to the humiliated communities to the project of modernization, which was launched by colonial powers, often erases cultural memory. So some of the anti-caste movements in post-independence India embraced a pragmatic and rationalist ideology, but this also resulted in the loss of roots sometimes, or the moving away from traditions and losing the mythologies of those communities. Therefore, writers like Kambar or the very famous Dalit writer in Kannada, uh, Devanuru Mahadeva, particularly in his work Kusuma Ballet, for example, they go back to the collective myths of this marginalized lower caste and Dalit cultures, respectively, rejecting the dominant and sometimes Eurocentric mode of realism. They adopt the folk and the myth modes to express the realities of these marginal worlds. Kambar describes the folk play as deeply entrenched in local tradition, religion, ritual. So, local fairs, festivities, dance forms, music, everything becomes an invariable part of this folk theater. Folk plays relate to almost all aspects of the rural community. So, linking Kambar's sense of place with marginality of caste, Taranat argues Kambar's insistent relationship with place also has something to do with his social background. His people, marginal and oppressed, employed the quote unquote mythical episteme to preserve experience. And therefore, for Kambar, quote, sensuous memory becomes knowledge, end quote. It is this folk memory that is transmitted through generations and disseminated across the rural community, which nourishes the folk writer's art. At the same time, Kambar engages the contemporary and the global context of our existence in all his work, as I mentioned earlier. The early poem, Helithini Keda, and then listen, I'll tell you, Helithini Keda, and then the two plays that are sequels to this long poem move through a whole range of historical and political cultural experiences. They traverse the colonial and post-colonial histories of his land. So, talking about the trilogy, Helithinikela, Huliyaneradu, and Rishashanga. Helithinikela is a long poem written in the form of a ballad, and then Huliyaneradu and Rishashanga are plays. And Rishashanga is one of his earliest plays which I translated, and I feel kind of deeply connected with it. So let me talk a little bit about it. In the 1960s, the long poem Helithinikela, then listen, I'll tell you, is followed by Huliyaneradu, Shadow of the Tiger, and Rishishringa, which is the last sequence written in 1970. Helithinikela centers around the tragic tale of a village chieftain, the Gauda. The Gauda goes hunting because he hears that a tiger is devastating the forest and then creating a lot of trouble in the land in his village. So he goes to hunt the tiger, and then what happens is tragic. He loses his life, home, and also his village. Huliyaneralu recounts the story of the young son of Gauda, Ramagonda, and the third in the sequence, Rishishringa, is the story of the son of the tiger or the demon, who is an impostor who comes in the guise of the Gauda to this village. In Helithinikela, a demon, read it as a foreign demon, takes the form of a tiger and becomes a menace to Shivapura. Shivapura is this microcosmic village, which is at the heart of all Kambar's writing. At this point, I think I would also like to share some of these the PowerPoint slides with you. I want to walk you through them. Let's see if it works. And here you are with Rishishringa, the play which I translated recently. Okay, now getting back to the story, the Gauda, now the tiger has become a menace to Shivapura. Shivapura is this microcosmic village, which is a village that is at the center of most of Kambar's writing. Shivapura is the village where all the mythologies which form a part of Kambar's writing emerge from. Okay, now in the story, the Helithinikela, there is a demon, this is a foreign demon, as I said, takes the form of a tiger and becomes a menace to this Shivapura. The Gauda goes to hunt the tiger, but the tiger demon kills him instead and takes the form of the Gauda and enters the village. He marries the Gauda's wife and starts ruling the village. Soon, this Gauti becomes pregnant with the demon's child. And there is another problem here too. The son of the real Gauda, Ramagonda, is traumatized because he doesn't understand what's going on. His father looks very different. His behavior is so strange. And when he looks at his own mother, she has come under the influence of the demon and she seems to have gone mad completely. She orders him to go and get the tiger's milk for the child in her womb one time. And she asks for his eyes, his ears, nose, skin, one thing after the other in the series. So there are crazy things going on there. And then the play, Huliyaneradu, centers around the Ramagunda part of the story. At the end of the play, we see this hapless young man about to lose his home, his mother, his rights as the first son, and perhaps even his life. There is only a kind of a vague prophecy that a sage will arrive and give him some magical water which can kill the demon. Meanwhile, the Gauti has given birth to the impostor's son, Balagunda. Ramagunda, who has lost most of the body parts, is away and he's leading some kind of a spectral existence somewhere. Balagunda, on the other hand, who is the usurper's son, has grown up and is sent to the city of Belagavi for education. Years pass, The last play in the sequence, Rishishringa, begins from this point onwards. Shivapura is now struck by a terrible famine. The oracle prophesies that if the chieftain's son walks into the village, it'll rain. Terrible events follow. We are taken into the mystery at the heart of the story. Balagunda cannot bring rain because he's not the real son of the Gauda. He's traumatized by an identity crisis. He feels angry towards the usurper father. And the final straw is when he finds that this father has gone and stolen his girl. Then he confronts him and kills him. This patricidal act is at once liberating and it's also damning for the angry young man who has no bearings in this culture. Kambar plays with the powerful local as well as the pan-Indian myth of Rishishringa in this play. Besides, he also pulls into the world of this troubling narrative some of the major concerns of the Navya literature, like the loss of self, or the question of legitimacy, and the problem of sterility of land and human life. So there are a range of preoccupations which this play highlights. Yet, in the final analysis, the solution to man's predicament in this play is not individual redemption. That's where you can see, among other things, that's one of the places where you can see a market break, a shift from the modernist sensibility. The Shivapura community must recognize the foreigner who's already within the self, and at the same time, he must be destroyed. Only then can it reign and Shivapura survive. The poetic brilliance which illuminates the language of both Huli and Neralu and Rishishringa is something that's marvelous. The earth mother that we see in the form of the Gauthi continues to haunt us with her deep sexuality. And then what she is looking for, she hankers for love, for rain, and the warmth of the body. And in the last scene, we see Rishishringa, who is symbolized by Balagunda, the illegitimate son of the Gauda, or the son of the usurper Gauda. He's sitting there all alone, brooding over the new truth that he has discovered in life. On the other hand, outside, the overjoyed crowd is celebrating the return of Ramagunda. Torrents of rain are washing over the whole village upon his arrival. There are rains, and then the prophecy is fulfilled now because he's, after all, the legitimate heir of the Gauda. Talking about this trilogy, Kambar has often alluded to how, even in his childhood, his village was acutely aware of the presence of British in India. The colonial domination brought out a cultural crisis and the loss of mythologies in these indigenous communities. It is this historical sense that impels Kambar to rework the original Rishishringa myth in his play. He employs the myth mode to open up the colonial and post-colonial histories that leave the colonized individuals rootless and with splintered identities. The next play which I want to talk about is Jokumaru Swami. And this play has been marvelously translated by my guru again, Pandit Rajiv Taranachi. And this translation is kind of a model for my own work, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. Jokumaru Swami was written in 1972, and it brings to the foreground another important preoccupation in the Kambar's writing, that is of the fertility gods. And then it brings this theme of the fertility god in conjunction with political revolt or rebellion. This play revolves around a myth figure and also raises crucial political and economic questions. In Jokumaru Swami, you see the myth of a fertility god who is worshipped by the lower caste and women. It's interesting that the god is worshipped majorly by the women here, and Kambar talks about it. Quote, women belonging to the caste of fishermen, washermen, line maker, or those who worship this strange god, Jokumaru Swami. Jokumaru Swami is a phallic god who is symbolized by, among other things, the native Indian vegetable snake gourd. His female devotees believe that after the worship, if they eat a curry made of this gourd, they will be able to seduce their men and also beget children. However, there is another aspect to this fertility god. He's a god of rebellion. He's a god of protest against the norms, both in sexual and political terms. The central character in the play, Basanna, is an image of this Jokumaru Swami because he too is known for his sexual prowess and also the ability to stand up to the village chieftain, the Gauda. The main theme of the play is a power struggle between the socialist Basanna and the evil Gauda, that is the headman of the village, who oppresses the lower caste peasants and helpless women. He appropriates peasants' land, for instance, and he perpetrates physical abuse on them. In addition, he demands that any woman in the village he desires must be made available to him. He walks in the village with his henchmen, bearing a gun that he uses freely on the village folk. However, is sexually impotent. His wife is longing for a child, but the Gauda's condition makes it difficult. Finally, she decides to bring the phallic symbol of Jokumaru Swami, that's the gourd, home, feed her husband, and get a child. Meanwhile, the Gauda, who has murdered Basanna's father and stolen his land. Sorry, is there any problem? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay.
Absolutely clear.
Okay. Because sometimes I see something going on here. Okay, right, good. Getting back to what I was saying. So there is this rivalry between Gauda and Basanna because the Gauda has usurped the lands of Basanna, and then he is also trying to kill Basanna. He's already killed Basanna's father. Now he's trying to murder the son. He plans to kill him in the fields. But the plan completely misfires. And then the Gauda's wife ends up meeting Basanna instead and falling in love with him. They have sex under the starlit skies. And then from then on, they become passionate lovers. Overall, Basanna not only challenges the Gauda by forming a band of rebels in the village, but also subverts the Gauda's authority in many ways. His sexual relationship with the Gauda's wife figures as a challenge to the Gauda, both politically and sexually. Although Basanna, like god Jokumara, is ritually killed at the end of the play, his traces remain in the womb of the Gaudi. Finally, a social renewal is prophesied in the play, quote, where the blood falls, springs the sprout and shoot, end quote. The play closes on a note of hope that, quote, a good government will rule, end quote, and justice will be done to the oppressed. No wonder that some of the socialist leaders of the time actually celebrated this play as a splendid text of socialist revolt. Jokumaru Swami is a play which actually catapulted Kambar to fame. When it was put up in Bangalore and later at NSD, New Delhi, it was directed by the famous director B.V. Karant. And then in a host of other major national venues, it made waves in the theatre circles. This much acclaimed play is seen as heralding a new style and a new mode of myth drama in Indian theatre. The play won the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya and the State Sahitya Academy Awards. And here is another very famous and fascinating play of Kambar, Siri Sampige. Siri Sampige, on the other hand, moves to the psyche not only of the male but also of the female. This play focuses majorly on the split self on the one hand, and on the other hand, the rich matriarchal ideals and the kind of image of the mother who sort of transcends these notions of what is legitimate and what is not legitimate, because she here figures as the earth mother who accepts everything. Now, Siri Sampige is a very, very celebrated play of Kambar. It won the Sahitya Academy Award again, and it has been translated into several Indian languages very successfully, and also into English by the well-known or in Spanish, Rowena Hill. It was a kind of a collaborative translation where the very famous writer, Indian writer, Kannada writer, Shiva Prakash and Rowena Hill were all involved in this endeavor of translating the play. As the play begins, we find that Prince Shivanaga of Shivapura again has come of age. His mother, who's ruled the kingdom in the name of the boy prince until this time, is happy that the handsome and intelligent son is going to take over now. But she's also somewhat apprehensive because there's been a prophecy which she and the palace people have heard of when the little boy was born. All through, the queen and the palace people have been scared of that because the prophecy has warned them that the moment the boy looks at his reflection, there's going to be a tragedy. So all the mirrors in the palace are hid, and the prince grows up not even seeing his own image. But now that he's grown up and there are new things happening to him, he's in love. And whom does he love? It's the woman of the Lamb, a shadow, an image, and somebody whom he sees as a perfect woman. The queen doesn't know anything of this, and naturally she broaches the subject of marriage to her grown-up son. Then Shivanaga tells her about this dream woman. He prevails upon her and the elders to do something terrible, to cut him in half and bury the two pieces. He assures them that if they dig the graves later, from one of the graves he'll emerge, and from the other grave, this beautiful, perfect woman of the Lamb. But what happens is something completely unimaginable. Out of one of the graves, a cobra or the naga rises, and then he slithers away as people watch in horror. Shivanaga rises out of the other grave. He does not find his dream woman finally and is forced to marry a lovely princess called Sirisampike. But he goes away every day to watch his reflection in the lake and neglects his wife completely. This neglected wife finds love, certainly, and also sexual satisfaction with his doppelganger, the Naga. The Naga has seen Sirisampike in his dream and is drawn towards her. He visits her every night, taking the form of Shivanaga. Soon she becomes pregnant. The prince wakes up to the fact that someone has strayed into his bed. He's furious. He forces his wife to take the test of chastity. Sirisampige wraps the snake in the temple around her body. The snake does not bite her. The whole city celebrates her purity, but the prince is not convinced yet. Finally, he finds out about the serpent and he challenges him and they fight a duel. And he kills the serpent only to realize that the serpent is only another part of him. Now, he too must die because half of him is dead already. Then he tells his mother everything, the whole story, accepts Sirisampige's child as his own and then dies. His last words to his wife and the mother of the Naga's child are, quote, "Take care of the child, don't ever let him split himself," end quote. The writing of Sirisampige actually has a story behind it. Apparently, A.K. Ramanujan, the famous writer and the celebrated poet translator, told the story of the split self to both Kambar and the other famous playwright Girish Karnad. Karnad wrote Nagamandala and Kambar wrote Sirisampige a little later. Both Karnad's and Kambar's plays focus on the problems of doppelganger and female sexuality, but Sirisampige has a very complex structure with a subplot, and the subplot is of two twins whose story runs parallel to the main story. The subplot now mimics, now mocks, and overall functions as a comment on the characters and events in the major plot. Now, let me move on to another major play of Kambar, Mahamai, which was written in the late 1990s. Mahamai is one of the major plays of Kambar. This also has been translated extensively. The conflict between fate and human will, inevitability of death, and the desire to live, power and love, mother and wife, these are the kind of contrasts that are very, very central to the play. Sanjeeva Shiva, the protagonist of the play, has a successful medical practice. What is more, he is the first son of Mother Shatavi, who is the goddess of death. She has promised him fame and prosperity. She dotes on him. So every time a patient comes to consult him, she appears either on the right side or the left side of the patient. So there is this understanding that if she appears on the right, the patient will survive. But if she appears on the left, okay, the patient will not live, whatever Sanjeeva Shiva does. And only Sanjeeva Shiva can see his mother. So the son has a very successful practice for a long time, but otherwise he lives alone in a small cottage with a pet deer called Netravati. A master of structuring the subplot, Kambar also introduces the story of Madana Tilaka, who's an actor and a clown. Interestingly, Madana Tilaka is an old man who goes chasing after young girls and he wants to increase his sexual vitality. That brings him to Sanjeeva first. Madana Tilaka is the one who tells him of the princess of the land. The lovely princess has some incurable sickness. Doctors have failed to even diagnose her illness, but Sanjeeva refuses to take up the case because his mother has already briefed him that the princess will not live. In the palace, this motherless princess, who's aware of her mortal illness, has decided to end her life. And the mode she chooses is going to a cave on the hill. And the myth about this cave is nobody who enters the cave will ever return from there. So when she's trying to enter this cave, Sanjeeva stops her. He's come there to pick herbs in the forest. He sees her and he stops her from entering the cave and promptly falls in love with her. And he agrees to treat her naturally. But Mother Shetavi appears in the form of an old woman and then warns both the doctor and the princess, but nobody heeds her, of course. From this point on, there is a terrible struggle between the mother and the son. Shetavi enters the palace and tries to work on the princess's mind, but she fails. She then tries to instill fear in Sanjeeva's mind by killing his pet deer. And for extra effect, perhaps, she also tries to kill Madana Tilaka, but fails. Sanjeeva and the princess run away. There is a beautiful and surreal scene here. The spirits of the dead people who had who had been rebellious in their own lifetime, and those who had challenged fate and death, flock all round the young and spirited couple. They bless them, show them a panoramic vision of the colorful universe in the forest, in the skies, and amidst the stars. But then the chase continues as the couple return to the earth. They try to seek shelter from death in a marriage event on the way, but it turns out that this brightly lit hall where they think marriage is taking place is only the makeshift death chamber of Chetavi. Sanjeeva sees thousands of lamps burning at different intensities in this hall. Small wicks, tall wicks, middling ones, they all signify the lifespan of a human being. So Sanjeeva is told by Chetavi. And interestingly, there are two lamps near his mother's throne. One burns high and bright. That is Sanjeeva's lamp. The other is faint and about to die, and that is the princess's. The princess is so scared by all this, she agrees to die so that she can save Sanjeeva. This pleases Mother Shetavi immensely, and so she grants a boon to her son, not the princess, but the son, and tells him that she is granting him double the lifespan that he already has. And there is a sudden and last twist to the tale. The doctor thanks his mother, and in a jiffy, he pours half the oil in his lamp into that of the princess and declares that he has gifted half his lifetime to the princess. The wick of her lamp starts burning bright now. There's a ghastly silence, followed by an explosion. The shattered mother disappears, and the whole death palace crumbles down. She disowns her son and withdraws her support from him. But the sense of freedom and victory of the human will the play leaves us with leads to an extremely heartening experience in the end. Mahamai is another very richly textured play which has been translated, as I said, even into English. Now I will move to another play which is written in an entirely different kind of form. And as I said, Kambar is a very, very versatile writer. So here is another play, which is a political play. And in this political play, he does not use the myth mode. He uses the realistic form, and even the linguistic idiom that he uses here is very different from the North Karnataka folk idiom that he usually uses in his plays. And you can see how there are some of the concerns, though, like about politics and about corruption and about the tragedy of human lives, which also figure in this play. Now, there are plays like Samba Shiva Prahasana, which are written in a farcical mode, but Haraka Ekuri, Sacrificial Lamb, written earlier in 1983, is a play which uses a different form, which is a reason why, although I have been giving you a chronological narrative more or less, I thought it would be interesting to introduce this at this point, because after a lot of talking about the myth mode, which is central to Kambar's writing, you can also see how he handles this realistic mode very, very excellently. So here you can also see how he maps the personal and the political. The play is a testimony to the manner in which he can handle all these different kinds of genres, forms, and modes. Here, he uses the rather anglicized Bangalore Kannada all along, and he writes it in a realistic mode. Harakaya Kuri is a political play that shows how the political and the personal intersect even in the lives of the so-called common people. This was filmed in Kannada and it also won the national award. The ruthless and the scheming political leader Rudrapa chooses the home of a middle-class couple as the place for his shady, nefarious activities. The couple, Saroja and Prakash, are a paradigmatic middle class couple. The wife works in a government office and she's in a minor secretarial position. The husband is a lecturer in a college. So, at the outset, the light-hearted conversation between the couple and the manner in which they talk about their hopes and their fears and their aspirations and their desire to climb the social ladder, all these kind of leave the audience with the impression of everyday city life. Soon, highly unusual, sinister, and scary happenings begin to take place in the space of the ordinary middle class living room. Rudrapa is a powerful politician in the opposition party. He has found this house for Prakash and Saroja at a very good price, but he retains the key to the house. The husband and the wife don't know that. And what he does is every afternoon he enters the house and settles down nicely with a drink and starts making phone calls. He conducts all his shady and corrupt business and all the dealings, even the political dealings here. One evening, Saroja is alone at home, and the husband has gone to attend a political speech of an actor turned politician called Shrikantji. Given his glamour and the ability to pull crowds, everyone assumes that he'll be the leader of the party if the party wins. Suddenly, Shrikantji is murdered when he's on stage. Nobody has seen the murderer because everything has happened so quickly and the murderer escapes. This murderer finds temporary shelter in the house of Saroja and Prakash. Then things start happening in a very rapid sequence from this point on. The killing of Shrikantji creates a sympathy wave for the opposition. Rudrapa is now scheming to become the chief minister. He first makes Saroja fall into his trap. She's borrowed money to buy gold bangles. Rudrapa makes a moneylender approach Saroja at home to ask for the immediate payment of loan. Meanwhile, he also arranges for a police case to be booked against Saroja for soliciting men. And at the same time, he implicates his political rival in this incident. Now, he arrives posing as a savior. Soon, he makes Prakash suspect his wife of adultery. Then he arrives and then tries to talk to Prakash about how he should solve the problem at home. And this ends with the couple fighting bitterly with each other. And it is at this point that Siddhalingu, the murderer, reappears in their house. He tells them that the whole plan has been masterminded by Rudrappa. And then Rudrappa has not only made Saroja and Prakash his victims, but he too is a sacrificial lamb. Rudrappa now wants to get him murdered to eliminate all the evidence against Shrikantji's murder, including the murderer himself. So now the couple decide to save Siddhalingu. But Rudrappa gets hold of him in any case because he knows every inch of that house. Now, the only thing we are left at the end of the play is this very humane act of Siddhalingu and then a little courage shown by the couple when they try to save this Siddhalingu. And that leaves us with some hope for the common man in the political jungle. Now, from myth to realism, you have another mode and another form of writing that Kambar has used in his oeuvre, and that is the interesting blending of myth and history. Now, he uses this history myth combo in a couple of his plays very, very interestingly. This dual mode shapes and defines his vision of historical events and their importance for the humankind. Shivaratri, Shiva's night, and at the other end of the spectrum, Kambar's most recent play, Mahmud Gawan, which I have translated, exemplify this mode of writing. As Kambar says, history often makes men act in ways that are self-destructive, but the folk ethos, which uphold the collective and community values, provide an alternate vision. I think since we are running out of time, I won't talk a lot about Shivaratri, but Shivaratri focuses on the last days of the great Veerashaiva saint Basavarna, and it shows the struggle between the king and the seer. All through, there is this very, very gothic atmosphere of political intrigues and then fear which looms large in the city of Kalyana because of these kinds of political repression. But what is interesting is Kambar chooses to locate the major action of this play not in the palaces, not in the places of the rich and the powerful people, but in the marginal sections of society, like the poor neighborhoods, and interestingly, the brothels. The whole play talks about how these marginalized and oppressed people uphold the vision of the great Saint Basavarna because this visionary and the social revolutionary was somebody who challenged the hierarchies of caste, class, gender, and religion. And let me move on very quickly to the play which I have translated and which is the most recent play of Kambar. This is all about the making of a martyr. Mahmud Gawan, the 2018 play, is set in the violent 15th century Bahmani times in North Karnataka. The play revolves around the brilliant political career and the tragic end of the eponymous protagonist, Gawan. It narrates how this idealistic and very humane minister of the Bahmani kingdom falls prey to political intrigues and then the kind of power struggles which go on there. Gawan's feat of winning the coastal region from the very, very powerful and formidable Vijayanagar Empire catapults him to power, and then he becomes the minister, the vizier, and then a profound scholar himself. Gawan builds a world-class university in the region. He's inspired by the legendary Sufi saint Bande Nawaz, and he tries to work for the harmony of the warring religious and caste groups in the place. But the malicious king's men who watch Gawan's rise with fear conspire and they bring about a rift between the king, who was once his disciple, and this minister. Charged with treason, Kavan waits for his death. At this hour, God Vitala walks into the Bahmani court, which is something fascinating. Until now, you have the historical mode, but here you see the God walking in. And how does the God come in? He comes in the form of a Mahar Dalit messenger, bringing with him a bag of gold. This is a payment for the grain from the royal granary, which Gavan had earlier distributed in a famine-struck village. However, the king and his court are impervious to the god's miracle. The drunken king orders Gavan's execution. In the end, the political intrigues and the power struggles in the Bahmani court, on the one hand, and the divisive forces of religion, nationality, caste, and class on the other, result in his tragic death. Another interesting aspect of this play is how he highlights the role of women. Usually what we find is the histories that we hear about, the histories that we read have a very, very masculinist kind of a narrative. But you see how women play an important role, and sometimes they even interrupt this masculinist narrative of history in this play. Neely, who's a maid in the house and who comes from a very marginalized section of the society on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Queen Begum, who is an administrator and who tries to stop her son from getting into the political plots against Gavan. She and Neely they become the moral centers of this play. So in a sense, this play is something which is fascinating for the manner in which it combines, blends both myth and history. At the end of the play, on the one hand, you see the inexorable fate of Gavan, who's about to be executed. But on the other hand, you hear a voice from the sky which prophesies a better time to come, which prophesies a time when there'll be harmony and when there'll be peace in land. So overall, what we see about Kambar's plays are the fascinating manner in which he brings in this variety, literary brilliance, and folk cultural commitment. This is one of the things which draws me to his work, and I find it imperative to bring it to the global English readers, both in national and global context. And maybe now I'll start talking a little bit about my Kambar translations and how I began working on his writings. And as I said, my approach to the philosophy of translation, if you will. But mainly, I'll stick to what drew me to Kambar and how I started working on his writings. It was something also to do with my growing up years. I grew up in a very vibrant and cosmopolitan Bangalore atmosphere, and as such, I've lived among languages. My home language is Telugu, and then Kannada was a language of the state, and English was all around me. My grandfather gave me the love of literature, and my uncle was somebody who made me read Kannada literature right from the beginning. So probably living in among languages and in these multicultural locations was what made me naturally gravitate towards translations. But when I think of my journey of translating the Gnanpith awardee, stalwart Kannada writer Chandrasekhar Kambar, my mind wanders back to that day, a very bright Bangalore afternoon, in fact, in the 90s. I was a disciple of the eminent Sarod Maestro Pandit Rajiv Tarinaji, as I said earlier, and Kambaji is a great friend of Pandit Tarinaji. So I met him at Tarinaji's house. In fact, the friendship between the two living legends is something that goes way back to the 60s. Even to this day, Kambar publishes his works only after getting that nod of approval from the maestro. Interestingly enough, some of Kambar's protagonists are also modeled after Pandit Rajiv Taranaji and his father, like the musical geniuses, the dreamers, and the idealists who figure in his novels like Chakori, Shikhar Surya, or his poem Ambigaran and Alavani. All these these figures seem to be inspired by the musical genius, a friend of Kambarji. So Kambar left that evening and I ran to Taranaji's library and looked for his brilliant translation of Kambar's 70s play Jokumaru Swami, which I was talking about earlier. And the manner in which the folk rhythms flow into English translation just held me spellbound. I felt the first urge to translate Kambar then. And I think I had also found my model for Kambar translations. But then it took a while before I actually started translating. And this happened sometime later, somewhere in the 90s. I was in the US teaching that very fashionable course, which was usually taught as a part of the post-colonial stream, global lit course. But much as I engaged with this course, I began to be kind of very sorry. So I'll just go through this very quickly. So after then I started thinking about how this global lit course kind of brings in a whole range of literatures from different cultural locations, different countries, and different cultures into one sort of a homogeneous course called global lit, or a homogeneous idea called global lit. And that is when I started wondering about how Indian literature gets projected in the global context. And then I began thinking about how Indian writers enter into this pantheon of what is called global literary figures. How many of Indian writers writing in Indian languages find this kind of global limelight was a question that I started asking myself. And apart from that, at that time, I was working on South Indian cultural formations. So naturally, I began to wonder, how can the South Indian writers find their way into these global contexts? And when I looked at the kind of translations, I found that there were very few. It was a bleak picture indeed. But it's also interesting to see there are only a few writers who become enshrined as the star writers within this global lit canon, because I think there is already a kind of a canon which is established here. Then I began thinking of how writers from marginal location from southern part of India, do they find this kind of global visibility or don't they? And what about the translations of these writers? This set me thinking, and I wanted to see what kind of work I could find to make it a part of my global lit course, which I was teaching. And that again made my resolve stronger of translating Kambar. So sometime in 2015, when I visited India, I met Kambar again. We discussed translating his works, and then we decided on Karimari, his earliest novel. What drew me to this novel is also what is at the heart of it, the archetypal mother myth, which is central to this novel. And probably it is this myth which also makes me relate to Kambar's writing more and more. So even as I was working on Karimai, his Shivana Dangura was published. I translated that too. Both translations came out in 2017. And last year, Penguin published my two plays of Chandrasekhar Kambar. Interestingly, the first earliest play, Rishi Shringa, and the latest recent play, Mahmood Gawan. So despite that being the anxious time of the pandemic, there were a lot of reviews and critical attention given to this work, which made me really happy. So now there is also another thing which I want to share here. And what I'm trying to talk about is how I think the pandemic, which we are going through now, when you can see the sudden increase in the COVID cases now, that fills us more and more with a sense of urgency to communicate, to talk, to write more, probably even in virtual contexts like this. So this is something which has been happening, and probably this is what has pushed me to translate some more of Kambar's works now, and I'm at the moment working on his children's folk plays. Now, I believe that Kambar's writing is extremely important for many things. One, the important way in which he moves away from the Navya ideology, which had become powerful in the 20th century, that was patently influenced by European modernism. Kambar chose an entirely different path, as I said. So his work not only draws on those folk rhythms, folk vision, and the collective wisdom of the generations of the rural folk, but at the same time, it responds to our contemporary times. And as Taranaji describes, Kambar's Ruritania includes everything: gods, myths, demons, dreams, tragic love, and terrible destiny, alongside tractors, co op societies, environmental concerns, or global business enterprises. It is this rooted as well as global dimensions of his writing that I try to capture in most of my translations. And what I seek to bring in is a sort of a seamlessness, a flow between the English and the Kannada text. And I strive to preserve the experience of the original, but at the same time, make it accessible, as I said, to the global English readers. And most importantly, what I try is not to slide into a kind of a glib exoticism, which I have often seen in English translators from Indian languages. Such translations have a kind of a very strong Orientalist bias. They have these long footnote sections and then exhaustive glossaries, and they strive like in an ethnographic mode to give cultural information. It's almost like a translator turning into a cultural informant. But no, that is the mode which I want to move away from. And the opposite of that is to try to desperately familiarize everything to the target reader, the global reader, the international reader. That again is a problem, and I try to avoid that fallacy too. So it has become something of a challenge, and really a very, very lively and accelerating challenge to navigate this very, I should say, kind of a razor's edge, a sort of a really, really tightrope kind of walk, trans transiting from the Kannada text to the English text. But I try very hard. The one thing I try is to make those rich folk rhythms come alive in the English text. And for me, translation is a creative act. And as Professor Ranu already pointed out, the paradigm I draw is from music. Think about how one sings a raga, or one sings even a musical composition, probably a song of Mira. Hundreds of musicians have sung that. But then when they sing it, they also kind of make it their own. And it is this kind of being rooted in the original text, but also at the same time making it my own and bringing something to the reader, global English reader of the text, and also kind of bringing myself into the text is the act that I see translation as. That's where it becomes creative, and at the same time, it's connected with the original Kannada or like any original text. Okay. So overall, when I look back, have I succeeded in this journey? But Kambar himself once pointed out, and that is something which has made me so happy. He talks about how I recreate the rhythm and the musicality of his folk language. And he told me that in your translation, I feel the sense of being home. And that, I think, is an ultimate compliment. Thank you. Thank you so much. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Professor Krishna Manavalli. This was brilliant. Thank you, because there is so much to explore in our own literature. And this comes alive in your talk, because translating an individual, translating a playwright or novelist is not just translating a man, a woman, a writer, but it's translating a nation. And by working on Kambar, you have tried to bring out the diversity, the variety that is there within our own culture. And another thing that comes out is very beautifully is that this talk is not just about translating one writer, but it is also about friendship. It is about regard and that devotion that you have for your own guru. It is your commitment to life, to literature, to music that comes alive through your work. Your translation is certainly a tribute to the legendary Kannada writer Kamber. And I must thank you for making his work available to all of us. And I would certainly recommend this writer to you, Chandrasekhar Kambar. My students must read, relish, and share his work, because I think he is one of the leading writer of our times, myth maker of our time. I realize that he's not just a writer, but he's also an illustrious academic and teacher. Chandrasekhar Kambar he has held the post of the Vice Chancellor of Kannada University, Hampi, and he was the chairman of the National School of Drama. So this work is a major work, and the translation that you have done from Kannada to English is absolutely fantastic. And I really hope and wish that some people, some of our own students and scholars of like translation from Hindi to English would also get encouraged. And there are some of our teachers, our professors who are translating writers like Nirmal Verma and Shivani from Hindi to English. And I think this is one way of bridging the gap between the various states and also overcoming linguistic prejudices. And this is a beautiful way of bringing people close to each other and respecting, admiring our own legacy, our own culture, our own literature before we move on to the world outside. It's important that we are able to explore what lies within. And Professor Krishna Manavalli has done this so beautifully. She has brought out the diversity of Indian culture and languages and traditions through her translation. Now, if there are any questions here, please put them in the chat box. There is a question. So Rupam, would you like to read out your statement? There's a question and observation.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Krishna, for that very informative lecture. My question is about since Kambar writes using a lot of folklore and myth in his plays, and we are moving towards a more post-dialectical and more post-dramatic theatrical performances these days in the 21st century. So could you please elaborate as to how you see the performances which are rooted in such tradition as Kambar's in today's day and time? Thank you.
Absolutely, which is what I was trying to highlight when I talked about many of his plays. Kambar is a folk writer, yes, but he's a folk writer with a difference. It's not like being, entrenched in the folk tradition and being a part of a folk tradition as it emerges in its own times. He is a writer who is inspired by this folk tradition, but who is writing at a different time and in a different space, and who is also responding to the different time and space within which he exists and writes. So the myth and the vision of the myth, especially the collective vision from which the myth emerges, is something that is very important for Kambar. And he also talks about how important it is for us in our times, in these times when we are so, wrapped up in our own individualistic egos, or like in our small narrow worlds or the small places. But these are times which pushes more and more towards a kind of an individualistic, consumer-driven economy. And then that is a sort of a culture which is being fostered now. And Kambar sees this myth vision, this vision of a collective life, the rhythms of the collective life as something that holds out hope. So in terms of the vision that he highlights, and also in terms of how he brings that very, very rich folk language alive, and as something that can express and as something that can respond to our contemporary times and the turmoils, political and cultural turmoils of our times, that is what makes him contemporary. Kambar is a folk writer, yes, but he's a contemporary folk writer. That is something we always have to bear in mind. I hope I have answered your questions. I hope I've answered your question. Is that okay?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. There is another question from Pragya Tiwari. Pragya, would you like to read out your comments?
Just a moment. Let me go there. Pragya, okay. Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad you liked it. This is like a really, problematic question. question, I don't know, is the first, unthinking answer that I can give you, because there cannot be one mode of trying to do that. You can talk in metaphors and I talked to you about how, a song of Meera, when you sing it, it is Meera's song, and at the same time, it's also there is something of you in that song. So this is something that I have tried all along with the way in which I try to translate Kambar. And dealing with his folk idiom is, of course, as I said, a tightrope walk. But there is one thing I always am very conscious of. Probably it also has to do something with my, training in music. I listen very keenly, because folk writing is mostly poetic, and it's often written very often. A lot of plays by Kambar are in the verse form. So there you see how the musicality of the language, the rhythms of folk Kannada, these become so important. I try to capture that element in my English. So it's very easy. It's not very easy to give you like, here are 10 tips or 10 rules to go about it. It's all about the choices you make, and then you make those choices as you go on working with folk idiom. But then one thing, as I said, it's not just lexis, it's not just vocabulary, it's not just dealing with, this is so culture specific, this is a cultural marker, what are you trying to do when you translate that into English? That's not the only problem. The problem is also about bringing that musicality, that rhythm, and then that whole beauty of language and metaphor into a language which is of a different culture. I try that. I mean, one can only try, but I don't know if I can give you any kind of prescriptive ideas about what to do.
Thank you. Krishna, there's another observation. There's Amrita Sharma. She wants to know, could you also throw some light on his poetic works?
Sure, yeah. Oh, yes, I would do that. And, it'll take me another whole session to do that. Maybe I'll come there next time and then talk about poetry for you. But as I said, Kambar is somebody who uses the folk idiom. And the folk idiom is something which is very, very richly poetic. So poetry is something which is built into that language. And something that Kambar has said very often, these kinds of, boundary lines or the divisions among prose, poetry, and drama are not something that he really believes in. Poetry is something that flows into his plays, and his plays are so rich with that poetry. On the other hand, even his prose writing for that matter, and certainly his poetry, is full of that highly dramatic element and the rich imagery and metaphor which he draws from the folk and myth ethos. So, yeah, I can talk a lot about his poetry, but then it'll take me a very long time to do justice to his very rich contribution to the field of poetry. And that's the reason why I started with Helati Nikela, which is like a proto-text in Kambar. And the manner in which this poetic text also, gives birth to two plays is fascinating. It's like a narrative which continues from this long poem written in a ballad form into two plays after that. So you see this sort of fluidity and the seamlessness among the different forms and genres of literature that Kambar works with. But to talk to you about his poetry, it'll take me, at least another session.
Yes, thank you, Professor Krishna Manavalli. It has been a rather engrossing session, and you've given us an insight into this great man.